The first thing that should make you uneasy about this case isn't the tears. It's the timing. Because when a man tells a courtroom that the press destroyed his life, and he does it with a cracking voice, red eyes, and visible emotion, our instinct is to stop asking questions. Emotion feels like proof. Pain feels like honesty. And yet, in journalism, and especially in courtrooms, emotion is never evidence. That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This week, Prince Harry walked back into a London courtroom to continue one of the most consequential legal battles of his life. A battle he has framed not just as personal, but moral. A crusade, he says, against a press culture that invaded his privacy, harmed his family, and turned his wife's life into what he described as an absolute misery. Those were his words. Delivered under oath, on the record, in front of a judge. And if you only saw the headlines or the short clips circulating online, the story seemed straightforward. A traumatized prince, a hostile media machine, a man standing up, finally, after decades of intrusion. But that's not the story we're here to tell. Because behind the public testimony, there may be another version of events. One that didn't make it into the witness box. One that wasn't read aloud in court. One that exists not in speeches or statements, but in private messages, call logs, and quiet acknowledgments that were never meant to be seen. And the person holding those receipts is not a journalist, not a tabloid, not a media executive. It's Chelsy D. That's where this story becomes uncomfortable. Prince Harry's case is part of a wider lawsuit against Associated Newspapers, the company behind the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. He accuses the publisher of illegally gathering private information, using unlawful tactics to intrude on his personal life. Associated Newspapers has vigorously denied those allegations. That legal tension alone would be enough for a high-stakes trial. But layered on top of it is something far more fragile: credibility. Because when you accuse an institution of wrongdoing, the strength of your case doesn't rest only on what they may have done. It rests on whether your own account holds together under scrutiny. And this week, scrutiny arrived in an unexpected form. Prince Harry did not just describe harm to himself. He spoke emotionally about the toll the press allegedly took on his wife, Meghan Markle. He described relentless pressure, ongoing attacks, a campaign, in his words, that made my wife's life an absolute misery. He choked back tears. That moment landed hard. It was replayed everywhere. It did what moments like that always do. It froze the narrative. It made questioning feel cruel. It made skepticism feel almost immoral. But journalism doesn't work on sympathy, and courts don't either. The real question isn't whether Prince Harry feels wronged. The real question is whether the story he told publicly aligns with what he knew privately at the time the alleged leaks occurred. Because here's the detail that doesn't sit comfortably. According to material now being quietly discussed in legal and media circles, there are private communications in which Prince Harry reportedly acknowledged something very different from what he later told the court. Messages and call logs that suggest he was aware, at the time, that specific details about his life did not come from tabloids at all. They came from inside the palace. A former aide, not a reporter, not a photographer, not a newspaper, an internal source, if that's true. And we are being careful here, because this is not a verdict, not an accusation, not a conclusion. Then the implications are enormous. Because blaming the press for a leak you privately know came from an internal aide is not a minor inconsistency. It goes to the heart of the legal claim. It raises questions about intent, about narrative framing, about whether the courtroom version of events was simplified or selectively incomplete. And this is where Chelsy D re-enters the picture. For years, she existed in the public imagination as a footnote, the ex-girlfriend, the woman who left before the royal storm fully arrived, the one who, according to popular retellings, couldn't handle the pressure. But that framing misses something critical. Chelsy D is not a tabloid personality. She is legally trained, methodical, private to a fault. She has spent years actively avoiding media attention, not courting it. And she is one of the few people who communicated with Prince Harry during the exact periods now under legal scrutiny, which raises a simple but uncomfortable question. Why would someone like that come forward now? The answer, if you listen closely to those familiar with the situation, isn't revenge. It isn't attention, and it isn't a desire to relitigate a long-dead relationship. It's discomfort. Discomfort with watching a narrative solidify in public that doesn't align with what she remembers or what she can document. Discomfort with the idea that blame has been placed outward when responsibility may lie closer to home. And perhaps most importantly, discomfort with silence. Because silence is easy when the story feels messy. Silence is easy when the truth is inconvenient. Silence is easy until someone steps into a courtroom, raises their right hand, and tells a version of events that hardens into record. That's when silence becomes complicity. Now, to be clear, Chelsy D has not stood at a press conference waving screenshots. She has not given a tell-all interview. There has been no dramatic public reveal. That's what makes this so unsettling. The information exists quietly, in messages, in timestamps, in call logs that line up with specific articles and specific moments. Evidence that doesn't shout, but waits. And waiting evidence is often the most dangerous kind, because when it finally surfaces, it doesn't just challenge what was said, it challenges why it was said that way. As this case unfolds in London's High Court, the focus remains officially on whether journalists crossed legal lines, on whether privacy was violated, on whether the British tabloid culture operates within the law. Those questions matter deeply, but beneath them is another question that no one has asked out loud yet. What if the press didn't need to intrude because the information was already being handed out from within? And if Prince Harry knew that at the time, why did the public narrative point elsewhere? This isn't about dismissing pain. Trauma can be real even when narratives are flawed. Hurt doesn't vanish because details get messy. People can suffer and still misrepresent facts. Sometimes unconsciously, sometimes strategically. That's what makes this story so delicate. There is a difference between being a victim of intrusion and being the author of a simplified story. There is a difference between emotional truth and factual completeness. And courts, unlike audiences, are trained to notice the gap. Right now, Prince Harry's legal war is framed as a moral stand against a predatory media machine. And in many cases, that machine has deserved scrutiny. But what happens when the machine isn't the source of the leak in question? What happens when the villain is closer, quieter, and far less convenient? And what happens when someone who once protected the story by staying silent decides that silence is no longer acceptable? Because if the private messages Chelsy D reportedly holds align with what sources suggest, then this case isn't just about newspapers. It's about narrative responsibility. It's about whether a courtroom was given the full picture. And it's about what happens when a carefully constructed public story begins to fracture, not from external attack, but from internal contradiction. For now, none of this has been argued openly before the judge. None of it has been addressed directly by Prince Harry. None of it has been tested in cross-examination yet, but the existence of these communications changes the temperature of the room. It reframes the stakes. It introduces doubt, not about suffering, but about storytelling. And as this trial continues, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The most consequential evidence in this case may not come from journalists, editors, or publishers at all. It may come from someone who once knew the truth quietly, and is now deciding whether it can stay quiet any longer. Because if the story told under oath doesn't fully match the story acknowledged in private, then what comes next won't just affect this lawsuit. It will change how everything that came before is understood. And that reckoning hasn't arrived yet, but it's getting closer. What if the problem isn't what was said, but what was left out? That's the question that begins to hang in the air once you stop listening to the emotion and start listening to the structure of Prince Harry's testimony. Because courtroom stories aren't judged the way dinner table stories are. They aren't evaluated by how heartfelt they feel or how familiar the pain sounds. They're evaluated by coherence, by consistency, by whether each claim can survive contact with time, records, and alternative explanations. And this is where things begin to quietly strain. When Prince Harry took the witness box, he presented a narrative that was internally logical on its surface. Private details about his life appeared in the press. He did not consent to those details being shared. Therefore, the press must have obtained them through unlawful means. It's a chain of reasoning that feels almost intuitive, especially if you already distrust tabloids. But intuition isn't evidence. And logic, when examined closely, often reveals assumptions hiding inside it. One of those assumptions is this: that the press was the primary or only possible source of the information in question. Harry disputed the idea that journalists relied on legitimate sources. He rejected the suggestion that insiders or acquaintances might have been responsible. He framed the leaks as the product of intrusion, surveillance, in a culture of illegality. That framing matters, because the legal burden shifts dramatically depending on where the information originated. If journalists hacked phones or intercepted communications, that's potentially unlawful. If they received information from a willing source, even an unethical one, that is an entirely different legal category. Morally questionable, perhaps, but not necessarily illegal. And yet, throughout the testimony, the possibility of an internal source was treated not as a competing explanation, but almost as a distraction, something implausible, something the defense raised to muddy the waters. But here's the thing: you don't have to prove that journalists broke the law if you can show that the witness knew, at the time, that someone else was responsible, and still chose to publicly attribute blame elsewhere. That doesn't automatically mean perjury. Courts are careful with words like that, but it does raise questions about selective framing, about narrative emphasis, about what was foreground and what was quietly pushed to the margins. And those margins are where this story lives. Because long before this courtroom testimony, long before this lawsuit crystallized into its current form, there were private conversations happening. Conversations that weren't meant for judges or journalists. Conversations that weren't designed to persuade anyone. They were designed to understand what was happening. When specific details began appearing in the press, details that felt too precise, too context-rich to be the result of generic reporting, Harry didn't immediately jump to blaming tabloids in private. According to multiple accounts familiar with the communications, his first reaction was confusion, then suspicion, and then recognition. The recognition didn't point outward. It pointed inward. Someone close. Someone with access. Someone who knew schedules, conversations, emotional states. Someone who didn't need to intrude because they were already inside. This is where timelines become critical. Because in court, Harry spoke as if the realization that insiders could leak information came later, as a defensive argument raised by the publisher. But the timestamps tell a more complicated story. There are messages, again, we are careful here, in which he reportedly acknowledged the possibility, even the likelihood, that a palace aide had spoken to the press. Messages that predate some of the articles now central to the lawsuit. Messages that suggest awareness, not after-the-fact rationalization. And that awareness matters. Because if you know, at the time, that a leak didn't come from hacking or surveillance, but from a person within your circle, the meaning of later accusations changes. It doesn't mean you weren't hurt. It doesn't mean you weren't angry. It doesn't mean the press acted ethically. But it does mean the story becomes less binary, less victim versus villain, more complicated, more human, and more legally fragile. Now ask yourself this, and sit with it for a moment. If you are aware that an internal aide leaked information, why continue to frame the harm as the result of illegal journalistic behavior? There are answers that don't involve malice. Sometimes people simplify stories because complexity weakens impact. Sometimes they collapse multiple grievances into a single enemy because fighting on one front feels survivable, while fighting on several feels overwhelming. Sometimes emotional truth overtakes factual precision. But courts don't operate on emotional truth. They operate on record. This is where the phrase, the courtroom version, begins to take shape. It's not necessarily false. It's curated. A version of events that emphasizes certain causes and minimizes others. A version that aligns with the legal strategy. A version that feels clean enough to argue. And that's exactly why the existence of private acknowledgments is so destabilizing. Because they suggest that the version told under oath may not be the only version Harry believed, or even the first one. This isn't unusual in human terms. People revise their understanding of events all the time. Memory is fluid. Trauma reshapes perception. Narratives evolve. But when those revisions align neatly with legal objectives, scrutiny follows. And scrutiny is not kind. The defense in this case has already leaned heavily on the argument that journalists relied on legitimate sources. That the information published was not obtained through unlawful means, but through people willing to talk. At the time, That argument sounded like a generic industry defense. Now it sounds more precise. Because if Prince Harry privately acknowledged an internal source, then the defense isn't inventing a hypothetical. It's pointing toward a known alternative explanation. And if that explanation existed before the lawsuit was filed, the court will want to know why it wasn't front and center. Why wasn't the possibility of internal leaks explored fully? Why wasn't the distinction between emotional harm and legal culpability made explicit? Why was the blame framed so narrowly? These aren't questions of character. They're questions of construction. How a story was built, how it was presented, and how much was left outside the frame. There's another layer here, and it's uncomfortable to sit with. Prince Harry has positioned himself as a reformer. Someone fighting not just for himself, but for broader change in media behavior. That's a powerful role. But reform movements depend on credibility, on precision, on the ability to say, this happened, and here is exactly how. When stories blur, even for understandable reasons, they weaken the cause they're meant to serve. Because critics don't need to disprove every allegation. They only need to show inconsistency. And inconsistency is where this case is now vulnerable. This is why Chelsy Davy's role is so unsettling. Not because she is antagonistic, but because she represents an earlier, quieter moment in the story. A moment before legal strategies hardened, before public narratives calcified, before blame found its permanent target. She exists in the timeline before the courtroom version became dominant, which makes her perspective dangerous, not because it's loud, but because it's anchored in when people were still trying to figure out what had happened, not yet trying to prove something. And that's the version of events courts trust most. The version that exists before incentives kick in, before reputations are on the line, before silence becomes strategic. None of this proves anything on its own. That's important to say. Evidence is an implication, and implication isn't guilt. But patterns matter. Timelines matter. What someone knew, when they knew it, and how that knowledge evolved, or was repackaged, matters deeply. And as this case continues, the courtroom will be forced to confront a simple but destabilizing possibility. That the legal war Prince Harry is fighting against the tabloids may be built on a story that was already fractured before it ever reached the judge. A story where the source of harm wasn't singular, where blame was redistributed, where complexity was smoothed out for the sake of clarity and strategy. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Because if the press wasn't the original intruder, then the question becomes not just what the tabloids did, but why the narrative needed them to be the primary villain. And that question leads somewhere far more uncomfortable than any headline ever could. Why does Chelsy Davy matter now? Not historically, not romantically, now. Because if this were simply about an ex resurfacing years later with opinions, it wouldn't be worth your time. Courts don't care about feelings long after the fact. Journalists don't build cases on nostalgia. And credibility doesn't come from proximity alone. Chelsy Davy matters because of timing, access, and restraint. And because she exists in the part of the story that predates performance. Before the witness box, before the speeches, before the narrative settled into something repeatable. She was there during the moment when confusion still outweighed certainty. What's striking, and this is easy to miss if you're not looking closely, is how long she stayed out of everything. Years passed. Entire media cycles burned out. Memoirs were published. Interviews were given. Court cases announced. And still, nothing from her. No counter-narrative. No public corrections. No anonymous leaks. That silence wasn't accidental. People close to her describe it as deliberate, almost disciplined. A decision not to become part of a story that was already spinning faster than facts could keep up with. And yet silence has a shelf life. It works until it doesn't. Because silence depends on one condition, that the public version of events doesn't cross a line where omission starts to feel like distortion. That line appears to have been crossed the moment Prince Harry stood in court and described a world in which the press was the primary, almost exclusive, source of the leaks that shaped his private life. That's when Chelsy Davy reportedly realized something uncomfortable. Not that the story was incomplete, but that it was hardening. There's a difference. Incomplete stories leave room for nuance. Hardened stories don't. They solidify into official versions. They get repeated, cited, relied upon. They become the foundation for legal argument. She ties the present narrative to an earlier moment when the story wasn't yet fixed, and that makes her impossible to ignore. Because if the court ever has to ask, "What did you know at the time?" someone else may already have the answer. And if that answer doesn't match the one given publicly, the consequences ripple far beyond this lawsuit. They reshape how everything that came before is interpreted. And that's the danger of early truths surfacing late. They don't just add information. They rewrite intent. And once intent is questioned, the entire structure of the case begins to wobble. Which brings us to the next problem, the one Harry may not have anticipated. Because it isn't just that someone inside the palace may have leaked information. It's that the identity of that person and Harry's reaction to them opens a new set of questions that no one has wanted to ask out loud. Until now. So who did everyone blame? Because before you can understand why this story is starting to crack, you have to understand how cleanly the blame was assigned in the first place. How quickly suspicion settled, not on a person, not on a process, but on an idea. The idea of the tabloid press as an all-seeing, all-intruding force that needed no help from anyone inside the system it was covering. That assumption did a lot of quiet work. It simplified a chaotic situation. It gave anger a clear direction. And most importantly, it removed the need to ask harder questions about proximity, access, and complicity. From the moment private details began appearing in print, the public explanation almost wrote itself. The British tabloids had done this. They always do. They intrude, they pry, they cross lines. History provided the context. Public distrust filled in the gaps. And to be fair, that distrust didn't come from nowhere. British tabloid culture has a long, documented history of excess. Phone hacking scandals, aggressive pursuit, blurred ethical lines. For many people, the idea that journalists might have obtained information illegally didn't feel speculative, it felt familiar. Which is precisely why it worked. When Prince Harry framed the leaks as the product of media intrusion, he wasn't inventing a villain. He was selecting one that already existed in the public imagination. That choice mattered, because once blame is assigned to something abstract, the press, the tabloids, the media machine, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge. Abstract villains don't defend themselves well. They don't have faces. They don't complicate the story. They absorb outrage without pushing back emotionally. People don't ask whether the media had access to a specific conversation. They assume it did, somehow. But real leaks don't happen in the abstract. They happen through people. Someone knows something. Someone speaks. Someone listens. Someone publishes. And in the early days, before lawsuits, before legal strategies, before public testimony, that reality was very much present in private conversations. What's striking, in retrospect, is how quickly the internal leak explanation disappeared from the public narrative. Not denied, not disproven, just deprioritized. It became something the defense raised, something Harry pushed back against, something treated as implausible or secondary. A distraction from the real issue, which was framed as systemic press misconduct. But here's the uncomfortable part. In the beginning, the internal leak explanation wasn't fringe. It was central. When details appeared that felt too intimate, too contextual, too situational, the first instinct wasn't outrage at journalists. It was confusion about access. How would an outsider know this? Who would have told them? Who had been present? Those questions don't arise when you assume hacking. They arise when you suspect proximity. And proximity points inward. Palace environments are porous in ways people outside them rarely understand. Staff rotate. Assistants speak to assistants. Information moves laterally long before it ever moves outward. And sometimes, leaks aren't malicious at all. They're transactional. A quiet conversation. A favor. A grievance aired to the wrong person. That doesn't make them harmless. But it does make them different. The problem for Harry's legal case is that different matters. Because the law doesn't punish journalists for publishing information simply because it's personal. It punishes them for how they obtained it. And if the information was volunteered, even unethically, the legal footing shifts. Which brings us back to the assumption that carried the story for so long. That the tabloids didn't need help. That they acted alone. That they intruded. But that assumption becomes harder to maintain when you line up what was published with who had access at the time. Dates matter here. Context matters. Specificity matters. Some of the details that appeared weren't just about events. They were about emotional states, private reactions, internal tensions, the kind of nuance that usually requires someone on the inside. Journalists can dig, they can surveil, they can cultivate sources, but they can't intuit feelings they were never shown. That distinction is subtle, but critical, which is why, behind closed doors, the question wasn't did the press cross a line? It was who crossed it first. And once that question exists, it doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. What changed was not the suspicion, but the strategy. As the years passed, as Harry's role shifted from royal insider to media critic and reform advocate, the narrative tightened. The internal complexity flattened. The story became easier to tell and easier to fight. Blame moved outward. The palace became background. Aides became invisible. And the press became the primary actor. That framing did something else too. It absolved everyone closer to the center. If the press was responsible, then internal trust hadn't been breached. Relationships hadn't failed. Structures hadn't cracked. The problem wasn't within, it was imposed. That's a comforting story. Institutions like comforting stories. But comforting stories rarely survive legal scrutiny. Because defense lawyers don't accept narrative efficiency. They look for alternative explanations, especially ones the plaintiff may have known about. And that's where this case begins to feel different. The defense didn't just argue that journalists relied on legitimate sources. They suggested that Harry himself knew that to be true. That suggestion didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged because of timing. Because there are communications. Again, we are careful, that indicate Harry acknowledged internal leaks contemporaneously. Not years later. Not in hindsight. At the moment details began appearing. That acknowledgement doesn't mean he approved of it. It doesn't mean he wasn't angry. It doesn't mean he didn't feel betrayed. But it does mean the idea of the press as sole culprit wasn't the only explanation on the table, which makes its later dominance curious. Ask yourself this. If you are aware that someone inside your circle leaked information, do you still describe the resulting harm as the product of a legal intrusion? You might. If you believe the press should have refused the information. If you believe publication itself is the harm. If you want accountability beyond the original breach. Those arguments exist. But they're different arguments. They require different evidence, different legal framing, different claims. What's being examined now is not whether Harry could have made those arguments, it's whether he did. Because in court, he didn't emphasize internal betrayal. He emphasized press misconduct. And emphasis is choice. The danger of that choice becomes clear when someone else remembers the earlier version, the one where blame wasn't so neatly externalized. This is why the idea of an unnamed aide keeps resurfacing. Not because naming them would be sensational, but because their existence disrupts the simplicity of the case. An aide has motive. An aide has access. An aide doesn't need to hack anything. And if Harry knew that, then the legal story becomes less about intrusion and more about amplification. Again, that's not nothing. Amplification can cause real harm. But legally, it's a different fight. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. That the legal war against the tabloids required a narrative where internal leaks were minimized. Not because they didn't exist, but because they complicated the claim. This is where irony enters the picture. Prince Harry has repeatedly spoken about the danger of misinformation, about the harm caused by distorted narratives, about the responsibility to tell stories accurately. And yet, in this case, accuracy may have been sacrificed for clarity. Not out of malice, possibly out of necessity, because fighting a system is easier than fighting a person you once trusted. Fighting an institution doesn't require naming names. Fighting an aide does. And naming names carries consequences, legal, emotional, reputational, that ripple outward. So instead, the system took the blame. The media became the face of the harm. And for a long time, that worked. Until the timeline resurfaced. Until the private acknowledgments came back into view. Until someone who was there at the beginning looked at the hardened public story and realized it no longer resembled the messy truth she remembered. Because once you accept that internal leaks were known, the entire framing of the case shifts. The press isn't the origin of the breach. They're the endpoint. And endpoints don't carry the same legal weight as origins. This doesn't exonerate journalists, but it does weaken claims of illegal acquisition. Which is why the question no one wants to ask is this. Was the press blamed because they were guilty, or because they were convenient. Convenience isn't criminal, but in court, it's dangerous. Because convenience creates blind spots. And blind spots are exactly where cases fall apart. This is the moment where the narrative stops being about tabloids and starts being about responsibility. Who had it? Who avoided it? And who may have shifted it? And as soon as you ask those questions, the spotlight begins to drift away from the press benches, away from the headlines, and toward the people who were closest when the information first slipped out. People whose names have not been said. People whose silence has been protected. People whose existence changes everything. Because once you accept that the leak everyone assumed was the press may not have been the press at all, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why hasn't that person been confronted? And why does acknowledging them now threaten to unravel an entire case? That's where this story is headed. The danger of evidence isn't what it says. It's when it says it quietly. Because loud evidence can be argued with. It can be reframed. It can be attacked. Quiet evidence just sits there, waiting, indifferent to narrative and emotion. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't accuse. It simply exists. And waits for someone to notice that it doesn't line up. Not with an accusation. Not with a revelation shouted from a headline. But with a timestamp. A number. A date. A sequence. Because once you start looking at the timing of events, not how they felt, not how they were later described, but when they happened, the story shifts again. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. When private details about Prince Harry's life appeared in the press, the public narrative moved quickly. Articles came out. Reactions followed. Assumptions hardened. And years later, those assumptions were carried into a courtroom as if they had always been facts. But timelines don't care about assumptions. They care about order. And order is where this story starts to misbehave. Because if you place side by side the publication of specific articles and the private communications happening around them, something becomes difficult to ignore. The reactions didn't come after the publications. They came alongside them, sometimes before the public even noticed. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. If someone reacts to an article after it's published, they're responding to impact. If they react before or during the process, if they anticipate details, question sources, or express recognition, they're responding to origin. And origin is the entire legal battleground here. According to accounts familiar with the material, there are private messages exchanged during this period that show Prince Harry grappling not with how journalists got the information, but with who might have given it to them. That distinction isn't semantic. It's foundational. The messages reportedly don't read like outrage at hacking. They read like suspicion of betrayal. A different emotional register entirely. Questions about access. Questions about conversations. Questions about who had been present. That kind of questioning doesn't arise in a vacuum. It arises when the leak feels human. And then there are the call logs. Call logs are boring, which is exactly why they're powerful. They don't show what was said. They show when people spoke, how often, and in what proximity to events. They don't editorialize. They don't imply intent. They just map contact. In this case, the logs reportedly show clusters of communication around key moments. Moments when specific details later appeared publicly. Again, this doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it complicates the narrative. Because the story told in court suggests a sequence like this: publication, then realization, then harm. But the private records suggest something more circular. Recognition before publication, discussion during, reflection after. A loop, not a line. And loops are dangerous for linear narratives. Here's where restraint becomes important. No one is claiming that Prince Harry sat down with a calendar and plotted a misrepresentation. That's not how human memory works. People don't experience events as future litigants. They experience them as people trying to make sense of chaos. But courts don't evaluate how chaos felt. They evaluate how it was described later, especially under oath. And when descriptions smooth over uncertainty that existed at the time, that smoothing becomes visible in hindsight. The screenshots, and that word itself carries weight, are not dramatic. They're not cinematic. They don't read like a script. They read like real conversations, fragmented, speculative, unresolved. That's precisely why they matter. Because real conversations don't know where the story is going. In those messages, there is no grand thesis, no manifesto, no legal framing, just a person trying to understand how information escaped a controlled environment. And that understanding, at least initially, did not center on tabloids breaking in. It centered on something leaking out. This is where the court version and the private version begin to diverge more clearly. In testimony, Harry described a sustained campaign by the press, a pattern of intrusion that felt coordinated, relentless, intentional. But the messages reportedly show something messier: confusion, disbelief, a kind of dawning realization that someone close had talked. That realization doesn't negate the harm, but it reframes it. It turns the press from initiator to amplifier. And legally, that difference is enormous. Because unlawful acquisition requires unlawful behavior at the point of acquisition. If information is given, even improperly, the legal calculus changes. This is why timestamps matter more than sentiment. A message sent 2 days before an article appears carries different implications than one sent 2 days after. A call placed during a leak window tells a different story than one placed months later. And when those timestamps align consistently, they begin to speak louder than testimony. There's another uncomfortable detail here. Some of the private communications reportedly reference specific details that later appeared publicly, not in general terms, but in ways that suggest recognition rather than surprise. That's subtle, but important. Surprise looks like shock. Recognition looks like confirmation. And the difference between the two is where credibility lives or dies. Now, let's be clear about something. Screenshots can be manipulated. Messages can be taken out of context. Call logs can be misinterpreted. Every defense attorney knows that, which is why the power of this material doesn't come from any single piece. It comes from convergence, multiple messages, multiple timestamps, multiple points of alignment. Not one smoking gun, but a pattern. Patterns don't accuse. They invite explanation. And explanation is exactly what this case may soon require. Because if Prince Harry privately acknowledged internal leaks at the time, not as a hypothetical, but as a plausible explanation, then his later framing becomes incomplete. Not false, incomplete. And incompleteness under oath is not something courts take lightly. This is where the human element re-enters the story. People rewrite their memories unconsciously. They emphasize certain aspects and minimize others. Over time, the story they tell becomes the story they remember, especially when that story is repeated publicly, reinforced by media coverage, and validated by public sympathy. At some point, the courtroom version may feel more real than the messy original. But documents don't forget. They don't evolve. They don't simplify. They don't adapt to strategy. They remain anchored in the moment they were created. And that anchoring is what makes them destabilizing. Because now there are two versions of awareness. The awareness reflected in private communications, uncertain, searching, inward-looking. And the awareness reflected in public testimony, confident, outward-looking, resolved. Courts don't automatically assume one is dishonest, but they do ask why they differ. And the answer to that question can reshape an entire case. There's another layer to this, and it's uncomfortable to confront. Some of the messages reportedly show Harry wrestling with whether confronting the internal source was possible, or even wise. Think about that for a moment. Confronting an aide isn't like confronting a journalist. It doesn't end with a denial or a correction. It opens up a chain reaction. Internal investigations, institutional fallout, reputational damage to people who don't have public platforms. It gets messy, quietly messy. And sometimes, people avoid mess not because they don't care about truth, but because they care about consequences. That doesn't make the avoidance malicious. It makes it human. But again, humanity doesn't override legal standards. If the decision was made, consciously or unconsciously, to focus blame outward rather than inward, that decision becomes relevant once it intersects with sworn testimony. Because the court isn't judging emotional coping mechanisms. It's judging claims. And claims require full context. This is where Chelsy D's role, and her material, becomes so fraught. She didn't reconstruct these timelines years later. She lived them as they happened. She received messages in real time. She answered calls in the moment. She watched confusion harden into certainty over time. And she didn't intervene until the public story diverged too far from the private one she remembered. That divergence is now measurable. In dates, in logs, in records, not feelings. Records don't argue back. And that's why they terrify narratives built on emotion. Because emotion asks for empathy. This is where things begin to feel uncomfortable, not because of what we know, but because of what hasn't been said. Palace aides occupy a strange position. They are neither friends nor strangers. They are trusted, but replaceable, invisible to the public, but essential to the machinery of royal life. They hear things not because they're meant to, but because they're there when things happen, and that access is everything. When leaks originate from aides, they don't look like classic leaks. They don't feel like betrayals at first. They feel like misunderstandings, like something that slipped, like a boundary that wasn't clearly marked until it was crossed. That's why identifying an internal source is so much harder than blaming the press. The press is external. An aide is intimate, and intimacy changes how people react. According to accounts of the private communications now being quietly discussed, Harry's early reaction wasn't rage, it was hesitation. A kind of disbelief that someone inside his circle might have spoken, not because it was impossible, but because acknowledging it meant confronting something far closer than a faceless institution. Ask yourself something. If you believe a journalist wronged you, you sue. You speak out. You fight. If you believe someone you trusted betrayed you, what do? There's no manual for that. Because betrayal inside an institution doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes everything around it. It forces questions about oversight, loyalty, and judgment. It implicates systems, not just individuals. And systems don't like being implicated. This is why the unnamed aide matters so much. Not because of who they are, but because of what naming them would trigger. Internal investigations, reputational fallout, institutional accountability, and perhaps most importantly, acknowledgement that the harm didn't originate where it was publicly placed. From a legal standpoint, this distinction is not cosmetic. If information is leaked internally, the press becomes a secondary actor, an amplifier, not an intruder. That doesn't absolve ethical responsibility, but it shifts legal liability, which means that continuing to frame the harm as the result of illegal journalistic behavior becomes harder to sustain, especially if the internal source was known or suspected at the time. This is where intent begins to matter. Not intent to deceive, but intent to frame. Did Harry choose to emphasize the press because he genuinely believed they were responsible? Or because confronting an internal breach was too complex, too damaging, or too unresolved? Those are different motivations, but both lead to the same outcome, a narrative that points outward. And outward narratives are safer. They don't force you to ask who failed internally. They don't require you to revisit trust decisions. They don't implicate people who are still embedded in powerful structures. This is why the aide remains unnamed. Because naming them doesn't just add a character to the story, it changes the genre. It turns a media expose into an internal reckoning. And that's a very different fight. Here's where things get even more delicate. According to what's been described, Harry didn't just suspect an internal leak. He grappled with whether acting on that suspicion was even possible. Not legally. Practically, aides don't leave paper trails the way journalists do. Their conversations are informal. Their disclosures happen off the record. Proving an internal leak isn't just difficult. It's often impossible without institutional cooperation. And if the institution has no incentive to cooperate, the path of least resistance becomes obvious. You fight the press. You fight the entity that can be sued, named, and compelled to respond. You don't fight the ghost in the machine. But again, practicality doesn't erase awareness. If the internal explanation existed, and the records suggest it did, then choosing not to pursue it becomes relevant once the public story hardens. Because the courtroom doesn't just ask, what happened? It asks, what did you know, and what did you choose to emphasize? And emphasis is a form of agency. This is where the tension between emotional truth and legal truth becomes almost unbearable. Emotionally, Harry's sense of violation may have felt complete regardless of the source. The harm was real. The exposure was real. The impact on his life and relationships was real. Legally, though, source matters. Because courts don't adjudicate feelings. They adjudicate actions. And if the action that led to publication was an internal leak rather than unlawful intrusion, the foundation of the case shifts. That's why the unnamed aide isn't a footnote. They're the fulcrum. Everything tilts depending on whether they are acknowledged. And acknowledging them would require answering questions no one seems eager to answer. Who were they accountable to? What safeguards existed? Why wasn't the breach addressed internally? And most critically, why did the public narrative move in a different direction? There's an irony here that's hard to ignore. Prince Harry has spoken at length about transparency, about accountability, about dismantling harmful systems. And yet, in this case, transparency may threaten the very argument he's making, because full transparency would require admitting that the harm originated closer to home. That doesn't make him wrong, but it does make the story less clean. And clean stories are easier to argue. This is where Chelsy D's perspective becomes especially disruptive. She wasn't embedded in palace hierarchies. She wasn't bound by institutional loyalty. She wasn't managing optics. She was hearing uncertainty in real time, hearing suspicion form, hearing names not spoken aloud, but roles acknowledged. And she watched as that uncertainty gradually disappeared from the public version. That disappearance is not proof of deceit, but it is evidence of evolution. And courts care deeply about evolution, especially when it aligns with strategic interests. There's another uncomfortable question lurking here. If the internal aid was known, even vaguely, did the press actually do what Harry accuses them of, or did they simply publish what was handed to them? That's not a moral defense. It's a legal one, and it's exactly the defense being advanced, which means that the unnamed aide is not just a character in the background. They're the missing link that could validate or collapse the entire claim. This is why their absence from testimony is so loud. It's why their anonymity is so conspicuous. And it's why the case feels increasingly like it's orbiting something it refuses to confront directly. Because once you name the aide, even internally, you open a door that can't be closed. You invite scrutiny not just of the press, but of palace culture, of information control, of accountability mechanisms that failed. And those questions don't stop at one leak. They spread. Perhaps that's why the focus stayed where it was. Perhaps that's why the narrative narrowed instead of widened. Perhaps that's why the courtroom version feels so resolved, when the private version was anything but. We don't know yet whether the aide will ever be identified publicly. We don't know whether their role will ever be examined in court. We don't know whether Harry will be asked directly about what he suspected at the time. But we do know this. The case cannot fully be understood without them. And until they are acknowledged, there will always be a shadow over the story. A sense that something essential is missing, because leaks don't happen in theory. They happen through people. And the person at the center of this one has remained deliberately out of view. For now. But as the legal battle intensifies, and as private records continue to surface, the pressure to name what, or who, Harry once suspected will only grow. And when that pressure finally forces the question into the open, the answer won't just complicate the case. It will redefine it. Because once the aide is no longer unnamed, the story stops being about the press and becomes about choice. At what point does pain stop being a feeling and start becoming a strategy? That question isn't cynical. It's necessary. Because when you listen closely to Prince Harry's testimony, there's a subtle shift that happens, almost imperceptible unless you're trained to hear it. The shift isn't in what he says. It's in how the story tightens, how uncertainty disappears, how ambiguity resolves itself into something almost disciplined. This is where emotion and law collide, and collisions leave wreckage. In court, Prince Harry presented himself not just as a claimant, but as a witness to his own suffering. The narrative moved fluidly between memory and accusation, between personal pain and institutional wrongdoing. It felt authentic. And authenticity is persuasive. But persuasion is not proof. Courts understand something the public often forgets. Emotion and accuracy are not opposites, but they are not the same thing either. Someone can be deeply, genuinely hurt, and still tell a story that has been shaped by time, belief, and purpose. That's not a moral judgment. It's a human one. The legal question isn't whether Harry suffered. It's whether the suffering was caused in the way he now claims, and whether he knew, at the time, that other explanations existed. This is where strategy enters the room, not as a villain, not as a conspiracy, but as an inevitable byproduct of litigation. Because lawsuits don't ask, what happened in all its complexity? They ask, what can be proven? And more importantly, what supports the claim being made? Over time, stories adapt to those questions. Details that complicate the claim recede. Details that strengthen it move forward. Not necessarily because anyone is lying, but because human beings are meaning-making creatures. We arrange events into arcs that make sense to us. And once an arc takes hold, it starts to feel like truth itself. Especially when that arc aligns with lived trauma. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Prince Harry has spent years articulating his pain at the hands of the press. Years recounting how intrusion shaped his childhood, his adulthood, his relationships. That pain is real. It's documented. It's consistent. So when new harm appears, new leaks, new articles, new exposure, the mind reaches for the familiar explanation. The press did this. They always do. That doesn't make the conclusion irrational. It makes it emotionally coherent. But emotional coherence is not the same as factual completeness. And once that emotional explanation becomes the basis of a legal claim, it stops being just a feeling. It becomes an assertion. Assertions carry responsibility. What makes this case particularly fragile is that the emotional explanation appears to have overtaken the earlier, messier understanding Harry himself had when the leaks first occurred. In those early moments, the ones captured in private messages and calls, the tone wasn't certainty. It was confusion, suspicion, a kind of searching for where the breach had come from. That searching phase matters, because it shows that Harry did not initially experience the leaks as proof of a legal journalistic intrusion. He experienced them as a mystery, and mysteries have multiple possible answers. The legal strategy that later emerged required narrowing those answers, focusing blame, drawing a straight line between publication and wrongdoing. That narrowing is understandable. Courts require focus, claims require clarity, but narrowing also requires omission. Not necessarily intentional omission. Sometimes it's omission by emphasis, by deciding which version of events gets told most often, most publicly, most authoritatively. And that version eventually becomes dominant, not just to the audience, but to the person telling it. This is where emotional truth becomes dangerous, because emotional truth doesn't tolerate contradiction well. If you feel harmed by an institution, evidence that complicates that harm can feel like invalidation. It can feel like minimization. It can feel like an attack on your experience. So the mind protects itself. It prioritizes the explanation that feels consistent with the pain. That's human, deeply human. But when that explanation enters a courtroom, it stops being personal. It becomes legal. And legal narratives are judged not by how well they protect the teller, but by how well they withstand scrutiny. Defense lawyers are trained to find the moments where emotional truth and factual truth diverge. Not to accuse, but to expose inconsistency. That's exactly what's happening here. The defense has not argued that Harry wasn't hurt. They've argued that his explanation for how he was hurt may be incomplete, and that he knew it was incomplete. That's a critical distinction. Because if Harry believed, at the time, that an internal source was responsible, even partially, then continuing to present the harm as the product of illegal press behavior alone becomes problematic. Not morally. Legally, this is where the phrase selective memory begins to surface quietly in legal circles. Not in a pejorative sense, in a descriptive one. Selective memory doesn't mean false memory. It means prioritized memory. The version of events that gets rehearsed, reinforced, and repeated until it feels definitive. Over time, other versions fade. Not because they were disproven, but because they were inconvenient. The legal strategy required a clean story. One villain. One mechanism of harm. One cause. Internal leaks disrupt that structure. They introduce ambiguity. They dilute culpability. They complicate liability. So they drift out of focus. And by the time testimony is given, the drift feels natural, unremarkable, almost invisible. But invisible doesn't mean irrelevant. Courts are uniquely sensitive to these drifts because they know how stories evolve under pressure. They know that plaintiffs don't arrive in court with raw experience. They arrive with narratives that have been refined by lawyers, by time, by repetition. That refinement isn't unethical. It's procedural. But when refinement smooths over known contradictions, it becomes vulnerable. This is where Harry's emotional testimony, powerful as it was, may have backfired. Because emotion invites empathy, but it also invites examination. Judges don't recoil from tears. They lean in. They ask, what is the emotion anchored to? What facts support it? What alternatives exist? And when alternatives exist that were known but unacknowledged, the emotional force of the testimony can actually heighten suspicion. Not because the emotion is fake, but because it may be doing too much work. This is the paradox of courtroom emotion. The more compelling it is, the more carefully it is dissected. And once dissected, inconsistencies become more visible, not less. The question hovering over this case now isn't whether Harry believes his story. It's whether belief replaced inquiry. At some point, the internal explanation, the aid, the proximity, the access, appears to have been set aside in favor of a story that could sustain a broader legal and moral campaign. That doesn't make Harry a villain. It makes him a human being under extraordinary pressure, trying to fight an enemy he understands. But the law doesn't judge humanity. It judges claims, and claims demand full context. The danger for Harry is that the court may decide that emotional truth cannot substitute for factual precision, especially when evidence suggests that precision once existed, but was later deprioritized. If that happens, the entire case shifts. It stops being about whether tabloids acted unlawfully. It becomes about whether the plaintiff told the whole story. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily, because the court won't just ask, were the press intrusive? It will ask, why was an alternative explanation not explored? Why was it minimized? And when did that minimization occur? Those questions don't accuse. They probe. And probing is dangerous when the answers aren't clean. This is where Chelsy D's material becomes even more consequential, because it anchors the emotional narrative to an earlier moment, before strategy, before litigation, before certainty. It shows a mind in process. And courts trust process more than they trust polished conclusions. As this case moves forward, the tension between legal strategy and emotional truth will only intensify. Because one demands clarity, the other resists it. And when those demands collide, something gives. The question is what? The testimony? The narrative? Or the case itself? Because if the court decides that the emotional truth Harry presented was achieved by narrowing the factual truth he once acknowledged, the consequences will ripple far beyond this lawsuit. They will reshape how his entire media war is understood. And that reckoning hasn't arrived yet. But it's coming. What happens when the court realizes it never saw everything? That's the question that starts to take shape once you understand how evidence actually enters a courtroom. And how much of it never does. Because contrary to popular belief, courts don't automatically receive the truth. They receive what is presented, what is disclosed, what is argued to be relevant. And relevance is not a neutral concept. It's negotiated. This is where the story shifts again, away from emotion, away from narrative construction, and toward mechanics. The unglamorous, procedural reality of litigation. The part no one ever sees on television. The part that quietly determines outcomes long before a judge ever rules. In a case like this, evidence doesn't arrive organically. It's curated. Documents are selected. Communications are filtered. Context is framed. And everything that enters the record does so because someone decided it belonged there. Which means everything that didn't enter the record was also a decision. This isn't sinister. It's structural. Litigation is not an exercise in completeness. It's an exercise in persuasion within rules. And those rules create blind spots. Some of them intentional, some of them strategic, some of them invisible until someone points them out. This is why the phrase, "what the court wasn't shown," matters more than almost anything else in this story. Because if private communications existed, and the pattern suggests they did, that acknowledged internal leaks or alternative explanations, their absence from testimony becomes conspicuous. Not because they were hidden, but because they were never invited. There's a difference. Hiding evidence implies wrongdoing. Excluding evidence often reflects strategy. Lawyers routinely decide that certain material, while true, complicates the case they're trying to make. They ask, does this help or hurt? Does it clarify or confuse? Does it strengthen the claim or weaken it? If it weakens the claim, it doesn't make the cut. And courts allow that, up to a point. But that point is reached when excluded material becomes central to the credibility of what was included. That's where this case is drifting. Because the story presented under oath appears increasingly dependent on a simplified causation model, press intrusion equals harm. Illegal behavior equals publication. But if contemporaneous communications reveal that the source of the information was known, suspected, or acknowledged to be internal, that causation model fractures. And fractured models don't survive cross-examination. This is where defense strategy becomes relevant. Defense teams don't need to prove